welcome everyone, also in English. My name is Lisa Nordström. I'm the Humanitarian Advocacy Advisor for Save the Children, and I will be moderating this conversation on a world of conflict. Why? That's a very big question and a very topical question, to say the least. As we all know, the humanitarian crises are raging around the world. We only need to open the paper to see how it's impacting us. And children who are the most vulnerable and who we work with at Save the Children are paying the highest price, typically. At the same time as the conflict in Ukraine is evolving, the wars in Yemen and Syria continue seemingly endless. This month, March, marks the anniversary of both these conflicts. Yemen is entering into its 8th year of the conflict, and Syria is entering into its 12th year of conflict. These are both very long and protracted crises. We also know that conflicts play a large part in Africa. It plagues Nigeria, where there is terror. It also has a great risk of an exacerbated armed conflict in Ethiopia. I think you all may have seen that in the papers fairly recently. So as we can see, crises seem both more numerous, there are more of them, but they also seem to go on forever and ever. How did the world end up here? Fairly big questions, but to support me here today with me, to discuss and hopefully answer some of these questions is Dr. Ashok Swain. I hope he is online so we can see him shortly. Can you see him? Not yet. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Swain, and thank you for joining us today. I hope we will see you shortly and can hear from you. Dr. Swain is currently a professor and head of the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at the Uppsala University. Joining us from Save the Children in Yemen is also, very welcome to you, Dr. Swain. I think we can see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I just presented you. I hope you heard. I introduced you briefly.
I have.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Very good. So joining us also from Save the Children in Yemen is my colleague Amjad Yamin. He is the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Campaign, and he focuses on protection of civilians, particularly children in conflict. Welcome, Amjad. I can see you on the screen now. That's brilliant. Can you hear us, Amjad?
Thank you. I can hear you perfectly. Thanks.
Great. So warm welcome to both of you. So for my first question, I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Swain. How does conflict evolve? Briefly. It's a really big question, but if you could try and explain to us in layman's terms the anatomy of conflict.
I think we have all, as you have mentioned, that the wars have come very close nearby. Of course, we used to say that wars have become rarer, not anymore. I mean, there are no wars. I mean, there have been wars, which you mentioned, that Yemen, 7 years, now 8 years going on. Afghanistan, we just moved out after 20 years. There's a strange wars like in Tigray. I mean, the country itself inviting another country to invade its own country, in part of its own country. Those are the things which we tend to forget, but they are becoming also deadlier. Because 30 years ago or 40 years ago, we were talking about the nuclear weapons war. There were 60 to 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. It has come down to 14,000. But that doesn't mean that. I mean, if you would have asked me 2 months before that probably nuclear weapons, the nuclear war was not as immediate as we're feeling or looking at now. I mean, I saw a statistic or a survey in the US that 35% of people think that they can really, they don't mind having a nuclear war. Probably they don't know exactly what it means. The way the nuclear weapons have become much bigger, much stronger, much way we have been technically advanced. But there are conflicts like before Ukraine conflict came in, there are 56 civil wars taking place. 8 of them have become extremely violent, 1,000 killing per year. And we need to understand that why they have become. And though all these 8 of them, these conflicts are not new conflicts. They're all 3 decades old, minimum 3 decades old conflict. Even if you look at the Ukraine conflict, it's not new. I mean, it has been going on for at least 1 or 2 decades now, immediate terms. So I think we need to look at it, why these conflicts are becoming more and more problematic, that we need to differentiate between types of conflict. The conflicts we are looking at it on the basis of ideology, they are likely to get settled if there is a settlement. Whereas if there is an identity-based conflict, which we are looking at, most of these conflicts, it's extremely difficult now to address them. And so these conflicts becoming more and more problematic or becoming intractable. And the UN peace operations, which were being quite successful in 1990s and the 2000 past decade, it's not anymore. And I think we need to really understand why this is taking place, because these conflicts are getting resources from many more avenues now than what it used to be before. The conflicts are played at a different level, though we are not playing, going for the direct war or direct armed conflict. The conflict is playing in the cyberspace, hybrid warfare. We are looking at people more and more than the state or the military forces. So those are the things which are making more and more problematic. Diaspora support has come in a larger way to support these kind of conflicts, drugs trade, arms trade. So these are the things why these conflicts are becoming more problematic, and the external forces. Whenever there are external forces are getting involved, these conflicts are becoming much more difficult to settle. We all think that we must come in and try to solve these conflicts. But whenever we are looking at these external forces getting in, these conflicts are becoming more and more problematic. And we also need to remember that previously the power, or at least immediately after the Cold War, there was a one power system which was trying to have certain kind of say to address these conflicts, but not anymore, because the world is gradually being divided in 2 different camps. So wherever we are seeing these conflicts, Middle East, North Africa, Asia, or even Latin America, and also now in Europe, you see that it's not anymore there is one power which is talking about, or which has the say. It's a 2. And also in some of the conflicts, which Yemen, I think Amjad will talk about, or I mentioned about Eritrea or Syria, you mentioned, the local actors or the regional countries are also playing their own role. Sometimes they're acting together with the world power. Sometimes they have their own agenda. So it's becoming more and more conflictual in that sense. How to address this kind of intractable identity-based conflict, where the world order or the world, the kind of multilateral agencies which are trying to work in a particular manner hasn't been working very well in the recent days.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swain. It is clear that there are many contributing factors that are impacting how a conflict evolves. Just to go back on a couple of things that you said, you actually did speak about already why they become more protracted. They're also more complex. If we go back to the question on anatomy of a conflict, I take it, you being a professor, you will know very well the details of sort of technically how typically a conflict used to perhaps evolve. Has that changed now because it's become more complex, more protracted? Are there other mechanisms involved in how a conflict evolves? If you look back to your sort of time as a professor and in these studies.
I mean, there used to be before only state actors were the main actors. As I was mentioning, that the military power was the only way of you can contain a conflict. I'm talking about the security terms, or not contain the conflict. But what has happened, in one sense, there is a very number of new actors have come in, which we thought that that's a good idea. It's a democratizing the actor, democratizing the security space, democratizing the conflict management space. But it has brought in, where you have more than 2 actors engaged in the conflict, from the different ethnic group level to individual level to international actors and then multilateral agencies and international powers, then we do have a challenge how to get them into on one, on the table, around the table and on one paper. That's something which is becoming more problematic. Then the securities are not anymore only about limiting to the military terms, because then we are, as I was mentioning, we are fighting the various ways trying to undermine each other. We saw that how the conflicts, because before we used to address those electoral system, political system in a way paying certain kind of resources or certain kind of funding to the agencies there. But now we can directly engage, the countries can directly engage in others' internal affairs, in electoral process, because of we are playing the cyber and hybrid warfare. So that is also making much more complex situations. Then the other situations which have come in, that as I was mentioning, that it's not about anymore the military power, but also the other soft security. The migration has become much more problematic. The migration issue has become hugely political in nature. That is also bringing in. Then there is no such, because of decline of democracy in the last 15, 16 years globally we see, then there is no such, unfortunately at the international scale, there is no dominant ideology now to say that this is where we need to proceed, because there is an opposition force which has come in, or another strong force which has come in, which is challenging the democracy. And also within the democracies, we are seeing a number of democracies are declining because of the populist authoritarian regimes coming up. And that is also weakening those countries, and those are also bringing new conflicts. So it is actually, there is no, there is one quick answer why these conflicts have become much more complex or much more problematic, how the conflicts are becoming developing. But I think it is somehow, as we saw in the Ukraine crisis, there is a very limited international community role now, how to contain these conflicts, because it is becoming much more complex, the kind of actors which are getting involved now.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Swain, for laying this out for us. A very complex matter indeed. Please stay with us. I will now turn to you, Amjad, dear colleague. You've been working for Save the Children both in Syria and now Yemen. As mentioned earlier, we are seeing the conflict in Syria entering its 12th year, and in Yemen its 8th year this month. In such protracted crisis, how do you see the situation on the ground playing out for children in Yemen and Syria?
Thanks a lot, Lisa, and I hope you can hear me well.
We can.
Some of what we see also speaks very well to some of the details provided by Dr. Swain earlier, particularly if you start looking at something like Syria or Yemen today. There is, because of the nature of conflict and the complexity, there is the usual that you can see very clearly. For example, if you turn your TV on, families are hungry, they are displaced by conflict, they have no place to sleep in. You have the obvious impact of the conflict on infrastructure in the country. Just a month or two ago, we saw an airstrike in Yemen that downed the internet in the country for a few days. Water infrastructure are getting attacked, schools, hospitals, and it largely affects families' access to basic services. It doesn't seem, it's not always very obvious, but the entire urbanization of conflict as well, where a lot of the attacks, a lot of the fighting is happening in urban centers, the impact is magnified very quickly. For example, all it takes is you damage one electricity generation station for a town of 100,000 people not to have water, not to be able to go to schools, not to be able to use hospitals. And then that has the repercussions on particularly the most vulnerable segments of society. For example, people who need hospitals the most are the more likely to die, the younger children, and so on and so forth. The other problems that we're also finding it challenging to be able to explain to people sometimes are the challenges that are being raised from the nature of the complexity of the conflicts today. Take a look at a country like Yemen. A part of the conflict, to say the least, is in the practice of recruiting children. we're not allowed to collect data about something like this for a start, because they don't want the world to know what they're actually doing. To just knowing how many children have been recruited and used in armed forces is itself a challenge. And the numbers we have today, just to present sort of what the challenge looks like, is we think it's anything between 3,000 children or 70,000 children who have been recruited. And the numbers are massive. Add to that, because of the nature of the complexity of the conflict, a lot of these children who have been recruited escaped from the ones who recruited them by force to live in an area controlled by a different party to the conflict. And now today, these children are being rejected by both parties to the conflict. On the one side, they're seen as deserters who don't want to support the cause. On the other side, they're seen with suspicion that they are working for the enemy or they don't have their true allegiance. And these sort of complex situations that the families, the children are left in situations of conflict is what's also making our work a lot harder. Another example is Syria. And I'm sure many of you have seen, after the defeat of ISIS, there were tens of thousands of people who escaped into displacement camps. Of those, there are at least 10,000 children who are seen by the world as linked to ISIS, many of whom are under 2, and they wouldn't even know what ISIS is if you try to explain it to them. But then these children are left in a camp. They're not allowed to leave because they are viewed with suspicion. Many countries are refusing to take them back. So they're left in a camp with very few humanitarian actors able to reach them in the first place, being punished for something they may not even know what that is. Another similar example from Syria is there's a notion of what we call just simplified widows camps. In another part of Syria, women who were previously married to fighters, particularly the foreign fighters, are not allowed to live freely, however, wherever they want to go. So they're forced to stay in small displacement camps as well with their children. However, because of the nature of these camps, if the children get over 15, they're not allowed to live there. So then the authorities on the ground forcibly separate the family from each other. On the one hand, to be able to exploit the boys and be able to recruit them to fight for even outside of Syria sometimes. On the other, they sexually exploit the girls in particular for money. And you have these families who are left in such a complex situation that even starting to untangle it is difficult. Getting the women out of these camps means they lose touch with their boys. Keeping them in the camps means they're left for exploitation. If you work in these camps, you are seen as supporting terrorism. And the nature of the complexity of the conflict, in addition to the regular sort of needs, I don't want to say ordinary in the sense that it's normal, it is definitely extraordinary. But in addition to the regular needs that arise from the organic turn of conflict, there are also the new needs that are particularly complex and particularly complicated. And they need their own creativity just to be able to deal with.
Thank you very much, Amjad. It's a dire picture indeed. Would you say a little bit what Save the Children is doing to support the situation both in Syria and Yemen, briefly?
Thanks a lot, not to spend too much time on that. So we try to we do what we call case management, which in most developed countries is essentially social work. We try to find solutions for the basic problems that these families face. For example, often what the problem is that they don't know where to go to for healthcare. So this is what we call case management, is having dedicated staff on the ground who talk to families, try to understand their needs, and try to link them to services that can exist in the area where they live, including possibly through Save the Children. We try to make sure that they have the basics. So in some places we do what we call shelter, we build homes, we provide tents. In others, we provide drinking water, make sure we build sanitation facilities that they need in camps. We also have some more sort of creative pieces. For example, in Yemen today, we're doing this really nice project where families don't have water. So we help dig water wells, we build water distribution stations, and we power them with solar panels to make sure that we reduce also the reliability on fuel. Then we take this water distribution station and we hand it back to the community to make sure that they have control over it. So we try to provide the basics of what we call basic relief items, but we also do a lot of what we call protection, which a lot of it is case management, trying to link the families together, linking the families to services, and so on. And the last one is we always want to speak out. We want to make sure that what people are going through on the ground is making it to decision makers, that the plight does not end up being forgotten, that is on the news, that the policymakers remember that this is happening, and to raise the cost of violation of international law against children in times of armed conflict.
Thank you, Amjad. I wanted to ask both of you, Dr. Swain and Amjad, my colleague, from your different perspectives, obviously, is there light in the tunnel? I think we're all kind of trying to find where the light is. Could you say your thoughts on that? Dr. Swain, if I could ask you.
I think we all, as human beings and in essence, we need to, we always come out of it. It all might look very bleak. The situation doesn't look so good at this point. But I think I'm old enough to realize that things really come back after some time. But for that, it's not that we can just sit down and things will come back. There is one thing which I think is important, that not as countries, as societies, we must learn how to mutual respect. We not only have our mutual respect, not only the countries or culture, but also to the political systems of each other. And I think that is where I do see there is a big challenge, which has been, even after the last 30 years, we should have developed that kind of mutual respect and not able to go into that kind of colonializing mindset to civilize other countries or to democratize other countries. I think it's very important that we should let those countries' people to decide what exactly they want. We can only somehow support or some kind of, I know that there is a humanitarian wage, we can provide those support, but not to exactly going as a missionary zeal to that we can really change things there. Then we also need to look at it, the history. We need to learn from the history. I'm not saying that we should stay in the history, but we should move out of the history after learning it well, that what history has taught us. If we don't learn this, like look, for example, I was till the last moment thought that the Putin will be looking at Afghanistan's and Soviet Union's and Afghanistan before getting into Ukraine. Or I was thinking also the similar way, when we have, or the West has gone also into Iraq or something, they will look at Vietnam or something. We don't do that anymore. We need to have those kind of lessons. I mean, if we don't even learn from others' mistakes, we should learn from our own mistakes. And if you don't do that, then we get into more and more problem. Then the third thing I think we do lack, and we need to have the self-introspection. We are not exactly in the mood to see ourselves, what has gone wrong with us. If we don't do that and keep on blaming others, I'm not saying that we should not blame others, but at least also we should look at ourselves. We must think that where we have done wrong and what we could have done right. Unless those three things which comes in, and I think we are, as human beings, as societies, as countries, we are smart enough, hopefully, to realize this. And that's what my hope is, that as soon as we do this, we will move into the new way of looking at it. And things, there is always this, these are the waves we have seen. This will come, but it's a bit difficult time now, but I think we will get better. But at least these are the lessons I think we need to learn from this experience, what is we are going through.
Thank you again. Amjad, any reflections from you? Any light in the tunnel?
Thank you so much. And I have to say, I cannot agree more with what Dr. Swain said earlier. We also see this not only with political systems, but also with people. We often go into communities believing we know how best to help them. And we've been taught more year over year that actually they know how they need to be helped. Our job is just to be able to do what they want us to do, if we are going to help. And on the light at the end of the tunnel in particular, I have to say that I do believe in that. People are resilient. You meet them every day. Sometimes you cannot believe the kind of process they've had to go through for the last few years. Families have been displaced 10 or 15 times. Children have had their schools hit once, twice, 3 times. And you think that this is it. But then they always surprise you. We've met children who lived in an abandoned car, 3 of siblings after their parents died, on their own in an abandoned car, and used sort of old blankets to cover it, just because they wanted to survive. And they were going to school on their own. We see this very seriously on the ground. People need help because of what they go through, but they are resilient and they want to live. And if we can help them do that, there is definitely light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you for those uplifting, I think, hopeful words, very much needed this time in the world. And that will have to be the final remarks for this conversation today. But before we close, I wanted to flag our next webinar later today, which will be specifically on the situation in Ukraine. It starts at 5:30, 17:30. Where we will discuss the developments in Ukraine and the possible scenarios. So I really, really hope you will either log in or stay tuned in this room to see us more then. And thank you both, Amjad, Yamin and Dr. Swain, for your insight and reflections and for taking the time to join us here today. Personally, I could go on with this conversation for much longer, but unfortunately we don't have the time. Thank you also to all the participants today in the room. Lovely to see you, and online. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.